going to have a very special event tonight. We are having it already. A night which is dedicated to Georgi Markov. And I'm sure that at least 99% of this audience do know who was and who is Georgi Markov. We have very special guests tonight that traveled from Great Britain to meet only with a few university audiences, one at the Sofia University, and the second meeting is tonight at AUBG. We have with us Peter Udell. You have his biography in front of you, and Hamid Ismailov. Both of them worked for decades at the BBC, and they were not only journalists, they were not only people who were high professionals. They were deeply involved in the dissident movement in their own countries. Mr. Ismailov was banned of publication in Uzbekistan, his native Uzbekistan, so he has almost the same biography as Georgi Markov, thank God, not the umbrella story.
I hope so, yeah.
Yes, and, Peter Udell was the one who managed and organized the broadcasting both for the Soviet Union and Bulgaria, and he has great commands on both languages. So he continuously comes to Bulgaria now in his capacity of a manager in journalism. We'll have a little old format tonight. We're going to start our meeting with brief presentations by our guests, and then the floor will be open for your questions and the answers by our distinguished guests. Okay, so Peter, would you start, please?
Yes, can I start? Thank you very much for your introduction. We are absolutely thrilled to be here, especially among you. You know, my son just graduated from the university, and I know your life quite well, you know. My son used to tell me that, I'll start a bit sort of, you know, provocatively and subversively. My son used to say to me that there are three things which we do: either sleep, or study, or socialize. There are three things, you know. We can't do all three of them together, you know. Either you choose sleeping and socializing, or studying and socializing. You know, you can't do all three of them. Thank you very much for coming and studying something here. Yeah, I know that you are in the middle of your exam preparation, so thank you very much again. We will be talking about Georgi Markov, as he is known in England as Georgi Markov. And Peter, we've got the privilege of having Peter with us today, who hired him for the work for the BBC. And let me start from asking Peter, you know, what was his first encounter? What was your first encounter? What do you thought about while hiring this person into your team?
Yeah, well, this is 1971, prehistory. And I need to hold this thing, do I? Okay. Okay, thanks. And what I remember in those days, there was this small Bulgarian team in London, some of whom had left Bulgaria in the 1940s, some in the 1950s, some in the 1960s. Almost all of them could never go back because of the prison sentences or other problems that they had because of their leaving. And this character who appeared in the section, of course, was in a quite different category from these people. The language he spoke was the language of the contemporary language, at least at that time. His knowledge, of course, of Bulgaria, my colleagues could read the BBC's monitoring of Bulgarian radio broadcasts. They could read several days afterwards, but of course these were not exactly helpful to discover what was going on in the country. And this man, who appeared with us, Georgi, was able to give them a perspective that they had lacked for years. That was in terms of the effect he had on his colleagues. As well, of course, when he began as a freelance to write some theatre and film reviews, what became very clear, again I couldn't judge this because my language wasn't good enough, but his colleagues were saying, this man is writing film reviews, theatre reviews in Bulgarian, which we could never manage to do because, well, firstly, he knew the film world, he knew the theatre world, and he was writing articles, writing these scripts for our cultural program with strong opinions, well argued, and his colleagues really were amazed at what he was able to do, and of course that they were not. For me, he was enormously helpful because my knowledge of Bulgaria, I'd never been here, I'd spent my life as a nice protected Englishman in an English environment, English university, etc., 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 and he was able to educate me as nobody else in that section could. So it was enormously helpful, this. We didn't have strict dividing lines between work and play, although I was meant to be the boss, and I'd given him this contract as soon as I could, which meant that he was working in the same way as everybody else was. But we went off. I discovered he was able to drink English beer, which was very helpful. So we went off to what I described as Krčma, locally to work. And we went off, I took him off to a play, drove him down for a play. And so we had this sort of social relationship as well as a working relationship. I had a very happy memory of Georgi when I was working with him, which ended in 1973. But so we just had two years together. But he said to me one day, that girl, Annabelle, I'd like to meet her. Now, Annabelle, I had worked with in another department where we were both scriptwriters. And I said to Annabelle, look, somebody would like to have lunch with you. So we went off, like to meet you. So we went off to lunch together in a little Italian restaurant. I introduced them, chatted together, and as soon as it was diplomatically possible, I walked out. And my little expression here is, and the rest is history. Because they got married, and then of course Annabelle became one of the most celebrated widows in Britain at that time, in 1978. I'll come back to that. My unhappiest memory is of meeting Georgi. I was at that time manager of the Russian service, but we worked on the same corridor, but I met Georgi and I said, look, why are you working 2 floors away from the Bulgarian section on your night shifts? Because on the night shift there was just one person. And he said, I'm afraid I might be attacked. Because at that time in the BBC, unlike today, anybody could walk into the building at any time, day or night. There was no control at all. That he was frightened that he could be attacked. And that was only a matter of months before he was murdered on September the 7th. I've one quick memory, if I may, Hamid, from a few weeks after the murder. As I said, I was doing the Russian work at the time, but my big boss, responsible for all these European broadcasts, asked me to go and see him, and I walked into the office and he said, have a look at this. And he showed me a photograph of a small, round metal ball with little holes in it. And he'd been given this by the police, and he said, this is the pellet that was found in Vladimir Kostov, who was a Bulgarian living in Paris, who 10 days before the Markov murder had felt this thing in his back. They'd managed to get it out, and he's alive today. Peter, my boss, then showed me the other photograph, which was a small round metal object with little holes in it. That was the pellet found in Georgi Markov. The two pellets were identical, and I can remember these two photographs 38 years on with absolute clarity. I could draw them for you now. I was just shattered because, as an innocent Englishman, how could anybody be murdered working in this organisation? But this, for me, was when my disbelief totally ended.
Yes, Peter. So, I mean, the last incident which you're talking about, the murder, came as a result of his writing. Did you know that he was a writer, that he came with a history to your service? And what was the impact of that on the service, on you, on colleagues?
I had no real idea that he was a prominent writer in Bulgaria. Totally honest. I mean, for me, he was somebody, if we took him on the staff, he could write these reviews, but he also could do what we very much needed him to do, which was translating the news, translating talks, translating dispatches from English, doing the night shift and so on and so forth, which was basically a translation job. And that was my very practical concern, because it was so difficult to find anybody. We found him, and he did these normal work, this normal work that everybody else did, plus, as I mentioned, for us, these film and theatre reviews.
Yes, it must be quite sort of, disheartening for him to do all this translation work, and yeah. So, what was his relationship with his colleagues in the team?
Before a film that was made about Georgi by a German television team, they asked me if I'd be interviewed for this, and I did some homework with some of his former colleagues, and said to them, how did you react to Georgi? And one of them said, well, when we saw, as I mentioned a few moments ago, when we saw the reviews he was doing, we realized that here was somebody in a quite different category, quite a different quality from ourselves. The other thing was that one other ex-colleague said that he was a great talker in Bulgarian. I mean, he just talked and talked and talked. Very interestingly, and I was looking back at my notes, which I brought here, this same lady said, and he would never talk with his back to the door. I don't know if you can get a sense of that. When I read this, I thought, and then I realized, of course, that it was again this problem of being attacked. Because what was happening was, and perhaps I'm jumping ahead of myself, well, there was, of course, the trial here in 1972, when he was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. So that wasn't exactly the most helpful thing to have happened. But then in 1978, January, Radio Free Europe, for whom he had, as a freelance, been doing a large number of talks, including the talks which you may know about, in which he talked about his walking in the countryside with Zhivkov, in which he talked about his visit to Zhivkov to say, do you really think this play of mine, Asse Dugata, I'm sorry, I've done that hopelessly, but you probably know what I'm trying to talk about. Is it really an anti-Bulgarian play, because it's just been taken off after 13 episodes, after 13 performances in Sofia. He then went to see Zhivkov again about Komunisti, which is the play which had been commissioned by the, I believe by the Politburo to mark the 25th anniversary of the revolution, shall we call it? I'm not quite sure what the language is these days. And he'd had a letter from the Minister of the Interior who'd seen the script, Georgi had, saying, again, I take this from the Radio Free Europe talks, saying, I've got to be big revisions. And I think there was a big problem at the preview of the play, so Georgi went to see Zhivkov again, together with the producer, and said, what's going? And of course, you had this extraordinary phenomenon that my colleagues were getting insights into Bulgaria, which they could never have had in any other way.
So apparently there was clearly two parts of his activity, one at the BBC and another one beyond the BBC, yeah, at the Radio Liberty and Free Europe and and Deutsche Welle. So what was the reaction of Bulgarian side of the Communist Party here to his work, you know, especially at the BBC and beyond the BBC?
Well, this is quite complicated. And I need to add, by the way, you said he got these different activities. There was another activity which is in the very early days in London, as well as settling in, as well as finding Annabelle. He did write this play, Archangel Michael, in English, with help, I think, and it went to the Edinburgh Festival and was in fact a prize-winning play at the Edinburgh Festival in 1974. So, you know, he wasn't simply doing radio work, he was writing a play at the same time, and I think beginning to work on a novel which was published a few months after he was murdered. But the work for the BBC, the reaction, I came here in 1972 when I met the Minister of Culture, a man called Georgi Markov, who very kindly described me as petite na proletar, not proletariat, bird of the spring. And I didn't quite understand this, but during my entire conversation with the Minister of Culture, he never mentioned Markov once. Markov hadn't really begun doing his Deutsche Welle work then, and he certainly didn't begin doing his Free Europe work until 1975. By that time, I'm sorry, I was out of that world. All I can think is, I mean, you know, because I met him very rarely when I was doing the Russian work, which was taking up a lot of time, but I think Georgi needed bigger horizons than the horizon of translating, most of the time translating, and therefore he did these freelance pieces for Deutsche Welle and eventually for Free Europe.
So the question is here, why BBC didn't give him this opportunity of expressing himself as much as he has expressed himself at Deutsche Welle and Free Europe?
Hamid, this is... Have you ever heard a provocatia like this? Basically, the work, as we saw it in the BBC, was not to cover Bulgaria in that way. As a news story, yes, if we knew that something was happening here, if there was a BBC correspondent here, if there was a newspaper article about Bulgaria, you know, if we could interview anybody from Bulgaria, except they normally wouldn't. I mean, when, for example, Ivan Slavkov and Lyudmila Zhivkova came into Western Europe, you know, they wouldn't touch us, they were simply going for medical care. Sorry. So we did cover Bulgarian events when we could report on them. But I think we saw our job as reporting on world events, on East European events, and if possible on Bulgarian events. But, you know, put it this way, Bulgaria was not a prominent, didn't feature prominently in any news agenda. The other thought is, of course, Hamid, we only had 15 minutes plus 45 minutes plus 30 minutes per day in comparison with other radio stations, for example, Svobodna Evropa, which had many, many hours in Bulgarian every day.
So it was the middle of the Cold War, and shall we now put into the context the sort of, you know, what was happening around? Yeah.
Come on, you're
okay. Yeah. I mean,
sorry,
it would be interesting.
Just to say quick, Hamid really, although he's from Uzbekistan, was actually writing in that place called the Soviet Union.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, and maybe it would be interesting to know to you that the same sort of, you know, phenomenon of dissident writing was happening in the Soviet Union as well. You know the names like Solzhenitsyn, Nobel Prize winner, you know the name of Joseph Brodsky, who was at the same time writing. So there were many dissident writers. So some of them, they were openly writing against the, you know, the regime in the Soviet Union, like Solzhenitsyn, like Maximov, like Vainovich and others. Others were kind of, you know, reluctantly writing about the, were reluctant dissidents, especially the so-called writers Шестидесятники of the 60s, like Evtushenko, Voznесensky, Akhmadulinov, Fazil Iskander, and many others. They were published in the Soviet Union, but at the same time, when some of their work wasn't allowed to be published in the Soviet Union, there was a famous case of Metropole magazine. They published it abroad in Germany. And because of this publication, all of them, Bitov, Fazil Iskander, Evgeny Popov, and many others were banned from being published in the Soviet Union. So the same kind of sort of relationship. And there was maybe a third group of writers, like Venya Yerofeev, for example. You know Venchka Yerofeev, Moskva Petushki, wonderful book. Yeah, who were sort of, you know, unknown in any sort of publishing world, which were publishing themselves or reading to each other sort of underground literature. It wasn't dissident in a way of activity, but it was dissident in nature. Because they were writing for themselves, for their friends, and discussing it with their friends, and so on and so forth. So there were different strands of this dissident movement at that time.
Yeah, but Georgi, of course, had his novels published immediately after they were written. He had no problems with this. Maget won this Writers' Union competition in '62. Success after success after success. All the privileges of this intellectual Bulgarian elite. The first plays, fine. Then, of course, the difficulties came with Kommunisti Azbyach Toy was the last one, which never got shown at all. But was it like that some things were published and then other things were banned?
Yes. Generally, you know, I mean, so to give a context of the writers and the Soviet Union, let's say, or the communists. Because you know, the communism was very ideological, yes? Everything was about the ideology, about the propaganda, about sort of, you know, I think now with the hindsight that they tried initially, the Bolsheviks, the communists, they tried to change the world. As Marx stated, you know, we are the first ones to change the world rather than to explain it. But they failed to change the world because it's so difficult to change anything, you know, in this world, especially human being. Yeah, and therefore they decided to, you know, to deal with the names. They started to change names rather than the reality itself. You know, if you look at the history of the Soviet Union, lots of names have been changed. You know, lots of places were changed. By changing the names, they were sort of invoking, in a way, to change the reality, in a way. It was very sort of mystical, in a way, you know, very sort of, yeah, mystical maybe, the way they dealt with the reality. And therefore, the writers, as the Gorky said once, the engineers of the human souls, they were extremely important for the party, for the authorities. I mean, the best retreats, for example, in the country belonged to writers. the best sort of, you know, every union of writer has got its own health system, whatever, you know, the lead font and so on and so forth. So writers who obeyed the Communist Party, they lived a wonderful life, wonderful life. They were sort of privileged people, the new aristocracy of the communist regimes. I do remember, for example, one line of a poem cost, you know, 1 ruble, which was, you know, if you write a poem, you know, of, you know, 100 lines, it's just a monthly salary of a person. Yeah. So, and imagine the sort of poems which were written, you know, 15,000 lines and so on and so forth, how much money you can make out of that. So, that was the privilege, you know, the communists, they tried to buy out the writers. But those who were not sort of, you know, conforming with them, they had problems, harsh problems. It was during the purges, Stalinian purges, you know, that all writers like Mandelstam, like Akhmatova wasn't sort of, you know, arrested, but she lived through very, very difficult. But many others, Zabolotsky, Mandelstam, Platonov, or Bulgakov, many famous Russian writers went through all these purges. So the same was continuing in a slightly sort of milder forms during the time when I witnessed already.
Okay, but the key question is, which I still haven't got the real answer to, what were you writing? And what sort of reaction was there from the party to that?
Yes, I belong to a sort of, you know, to new generation at that time. I came into the literature. First, my publication was in 1974, a poem, in the sort of, you know, in the newspaper when I woke up, you know, and my poem was published in the sort of Republican newspaper, and I woke up to fame, you know. But the same day when I was passing by the, you know, butcher, all of a sudden I realized that the butcher is putting, you know, a kilo of meat into the newspaper where my poem was published. That was the end of my sort of quest for fame, you know. Ever since I decided not to become famous on that manner. What I was doing, you know, my generation came after the 60s. The 60s, generation of 60s, Voznesensky, Yevtushenko, and all others, they were new Mayakovskys. They used to fill the stadiums with their poetry, with their sort of, you know, quest for the new beginning. Because it was after Stalin, they came after the thaw. That was the new beginning, new optimism, and so on and so forth. They were extremely ethical. You know, they were quite clear what is right, what is wrong, you know, extremely ethical, you know. They tried to teach all of us what's right, what's wrong. But they lived by one thing, they were sort of creating other things, you know. In their words, everything was absolutely clear, but their model of life was completely messed up, you know. They were all also sort of, you know, bought up by the communist regimes, and it's very difficult to hide it, you know, when you are sent to all around the world, when you are living a sort of, you know, a flashy life, so people can see that. So our generation, the reaction of my generation was, you know, to hide away, in a way, to go into the aesthetics rather than into the ethics, you know. We were more sort of technical, more Joycean, more Kafkaesque, and so on and so forth, you know, sort of literature for literature. We were writing very complicated texts, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, even now, my generation is still sort of, you know, trapped in this overcomplicated writing. As one of my generation, Sasha Yeremenko said, everything is in between lines, you know, between the lines. So it's very coded, very metaphorical literature. And unfortunately, that generation, apart from several sort of exclusions, never overcame this type of writing. Though, what I must say, you know, though we were writing this kind of decoded, very coded and metaphorical literature, what was interesting for my generation, the art of translation. We were translating quite a lot of world literature. We knew world literature much better than the Soviet literature. We were living by Joyce Carol Oates, by Faulkner, by Julio Cortázar, Borges, and so on and so forth, you know, translating them into our languages, into Russian, into Uzbek, into Georgian or Latvian and other languages. That was our escape in a way. So that was our escape.
Can I follow this up
Yes,
with some Eastern Europe? I need a tiny bit of help. Is anyone here from Romania? No. Okay, well, very quickly, if I may. If you look at the questions of your neighbours and what writing there was and how people were treated, there's just one case I'd like to give you of Romania, which is a lady called Anna Blandiana. You may never have heard of her, but in the 1960s, several books of her poems were published officially. She appeared on, or her poems were read on television, and then, in the 1980s, she started writing protest poems, protesting or mocking not only the Romanian regime, but also President Ceausescu. Poem Everything, published in a magazine one day, I assume morning. Within hours, the magazine was withdrawn, the editors found they had no jobs, and she spent years being harassed by the police. And that's perhaps at the easy end of the spectrum. Anyone at all from any parts of what was Yugoslavia? Ah, okay. And if I get this wrong, could you please correct me? You see, you think perhaps of Yugoslavia as being at the, liberal's the wrong word, but at the better end of the spectrum. Milovan Djilas, I think, is evidence of this not being very true. Joined the Communist Party before the war, fought with the partisans. Early 1950s, he wrote some articles in Borba in which he argued that a new ruling class had been formed. He was expelled from the Central Committee and he lost all his jobs. He then, in the New York Times, said that Yugoslavia was a totalitarian country ruled by undemocratic forces. For this he was given what is called a suspended sentence. He didn't go to prison, but he could have gone. And that was only the beginning. 56, he slandered Yugoslavia, said the courts. 3 years in prison. He then published The New Class, which some of you may have read, and if you haven't and ever have time, it is hugely worth it. 7 years in prison. He didn't always do the sentences, but this is what he was sentenced to. He then wrote Conversations with Stalin, because of course he'd had a history with that. 5 years in prison. And that is just one of Yugoslavia's writers. There were others who didn't have it quite as spectacularly. Anyone from Albania? Okay. Reputation at that time as probably East Europeans' most difficult regime, and certainly a lot of evidence that dissident writers were suffocated at the beginning, stopped, but with one big exception. This extraordinary, and I've read him in English with absolute delight, Ismail Kadare, whose books were published at that time, who was allowed to travel abroad, who lived both in Paris and in Tirana, or in Albania. He didn't always get it quite right. He wrote a politically satirical poem in 1975, and he couldn't publish anything for the next 3 years. He then wrote a book in which he was quite positive about Enver Hoxha. And he later said, after the collapse of communism, I quote, "It was the price I had to pay for my freedom." He then said something even, I think, for me, chilling. Dissidence was a position no one could occupy, even for a few days, without facing the firing squad. Again, you know, that may have been an exaggeration, but that is how he said he felt. Anyone from Hungary? No, okay, very quickly then. Can I remind you about a wonderful writer called, and I'll mispronounce it as always, Gyula Ilyich. He wrote a poem called One Sentence on Tyranny in 1950 and hid it away until 1956, the time of the Hungarian uprising. It became, I believe, a symbol of the uprising, this poem. The uprising, of course, was crushed by the Soviet troops, and it was not republished for 30 years. Anyone from Czech Republic or Slovakia? Again, no, but you must have heard of this extraordinary character of Václav Havel, who eventually became president, but let's forget about that. He took part in the Prague Spring. He took part in the resistance to the invasion by the Soviet Union and most Warsaw Pact countries. He then had found his plays were all banned, and he found himself working not in a theatre but in a brewery, which in Bulgarian is what? Brewery, beer. Sorry? During this time, he was constantly the victim of police surveillance, secret police questioning. He finished up in prison several times. One of his plays, which was The Audience, but there were others as well, was circulated in Samizdat, which was becoming increasingly one of the main means of communication by these authors. But what happened to Havel was that he refused to stop, and it was the only way he could be read was in Samizdat. And again, what I've discovered is that if you're talking about, for example, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, Samizdat didn't mean painfully written manuscripts or something typed on bad quality paper. Some of the Samizdat was published in literally thousands or tens of thousands of copies. I find that very difficult to believe, but certainly in Poland this was happening. I can't ask if there's anybody from East Germany because it doesn't exist. But there was one particular author, can I very quickly mention, Stefan Heim. He had left the United States, he was a citizen of the United States, went to East Germany to live out his commitment to socialism. He had a lot of books published, and then in 1953 he wrote a book about the uprising there had been in East Germany. The book could not be published. Erich Honecker, you may remember the name out of distant history, or not, who was the party secretary, personally attacked him. He got excluded from the Authors Association, but he never left East Germany, which is quite interesting, although I think because of his American past he could have done. Last example, anyone from Poland? No? Okay. Last example is a man called Tadio Chrombitsky. His first book was refused publication in, I think, 1948. He had to wait 8 years for it to be published. The next few books he wrote according to good socialist realist practice. They were published. He then wrote a book called Minor Apocalypse. It was not published officially, it was published only in Samizdat, and as I said, in literally thousands of copies, and every book that he wrote afterwards, he didn't bother about having it published officially, it simply was published in samizdat and got, I believe, huge audiences. What's interesting here is that in this context, if you think of writers who were imprisoned, exiled, as Wolf Biermann was from East Germany, he was kicked out, tortured, and I know one writer in Romania who, very sadly, she's dead now, could see in two directions at the same time, because what had happened to her in prison was that they had simply tortured her. But you know, in this context, Georgi Markov in Bulgaria had had I hope I get this roughly right, a relatively easy time. I mean, he was part of this privileged intellectual elite for a period of time. Of course, although he had perhaps an easier time than some of these people I've gone on about, no other writer of those decades, certainly that I know of the 60s or 70s or 80s, was murdered for what he had written. So in that sense, he was unique.
So, I mean, it seems that everything is history, you know, that we've learned from that one and we are now much better, we're much cleverer, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, it's the case of modern Uzbekistan, you know. I'm trying to project the same to myself, for example. My case is the easiest one. I'm banned in Uzbekistan, none of my books are published, so I can't go easily to Uzbekistan because all the consequences which might happen to me, it's me who are going to face, but not Geneva or whatever. So, but at the same time, I admit that my case is the easiest one, because there are modern writers, friends of mine, who are still in prison. One of them was recently released several years ago, Mamad Ali Mahmudov. During the Soviet time, he wrote nationalistic, in a way, anti-Russian, let's say, yeah, the book. And they decided to sort of deal with him, but luckily the, you know, the first secretary of Communist Party was a writer himself, Sharaf Rashidov. So he protected somehow him and he left. But when Uzbekistan became independent, he could have become the national hero, you know, who was fighting for the independence of Uzbekistan when none of people were sort of daring to discuss it as an issue. Instead of that, he was put in prison for 14 years. For 14 years. There were lots of amnesties, for example, you know, he was way older than 60 years old, yeah? There were amnesties, so everyone older than 60 should have been released, not him. There are people still there. For example, Samandar Khokhanov, the MP, who was also writing something, he is still in prison. He served a longer sentence than Mandela served. He is still in prison, for example. You know? There are writers like, for example, Dilmurad Said, for example, still in prison. Yusuf Rozi Muhammad, still in prison. So, unfortunately, the human nature is, you know, very difficult to change. You know, we think that we are sort of improving, that we are learning lessons of the past, of the communism, of the same case of these wonderful men, you know. But unfortunately, many people are still living this life. I'm talking just about Uzbekistan, but how many countries? In Africa, for example, in Asia, Turkey is becoming one of them. You know, so many countries. Therefore, the case of Georgi Markov should be talked again and again. And you know what? There is, in a way, unfortunately, there is an element of sensationalization of his life. You know, everyone knows about his death. Whenever I am asking, for example, in Britain, in the West, for example, do you know Georgi Markov? Who is that? Who is that? I'm saying a writer. But what he has written? I'm saying umbrella killing. immediately recognize, you know, immediately. But nobody knows any works of him. Unfortunately, on the Amazon, if you search on the Amazon, for example, there is just one book which was published years and years ago. Unfortunately, he fell sort of victim of this, you know, killing twice, when he was killed and as a sort of symbol, you know. He is known for his killing rather than for his work. But I think it's time, and especially I appeal to you as young people who are, you know, might become the people of letters or whatever, we have to give him back as a writer.
But in fact, Hamid, this is happening, or has happened in Bulgaria, because the Radio Free Europe scripts were published some years ago. The Deutsche Welle scripts in 3 volumes, I believe, came out recently. The collected plays have come out. And of course there is, I believe, at the Ivan Vazov Theatre in Sofia now, one of his plays is being performed right now. So I think in Bulgaria things are happening, have happened, and this initiative is part of this. What I am concerned about is, and this applies not only to Georgi, it applies to these brilliant people, such as I mentioned, Kadare and Iesh and others, that although a few people may have heard of the names, the number of people in Western Europe who have read these books is absolutely minute, and it's a tragedy.
It is. Here, an interesting sort of example from my past, you know, when you were asking what kind of literature we were writing and what kind of literature we were reading. Once, when I was young, I found myself in the hospital, in a Soviet hospital. And next to me was a sort of chronic alcoholic. But chronic alcoholics in the Soviet Union were the most ardent readers, you know? Yeah. They knew everything. They became alcoholics because of that, you know, because of their reading, you know? They could sort of, you know, in a way correspond to the, you know, the ideal life in the books with the real life in the reality. And I asked him, do you read any of Soviet books? And he said, why should I read? Because everything is about pashanitsa, pashanitsa. Pashanitsa means the sort of, yeah, the grain, basically. Everything is about grain, 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 rye and grain, you know. So why should I read this book? All he was reading was the translated literature. And funny enough, you know, what I'm finding in the West, unfortunately, it's the other way around. You know, nobody reads the translated literature. So it is a big problem. Let me ask you another question. We are talking about the limitations, you know. Let's talk a bit about the limitations on press, or if there are any limitations on press in the West.
This is actually a very interesting one, because if, for example, you look at the former countries of Eastern Europe, what I've been trying to do a little work before we came here, and it seems to me, and if any of you disagree with this, please tell me, that in the former countries of Warsaw Pact and so on, the freedom of the press and freedom of expression at this moment of time and in every single country is growing smaller. Yes. I think this is extremely worrying, but if I can just stay with this for a moment, my symbol of this is, I was talking to a man, a former colleague of mine who has now lives back in Budapest, and he told me that a newspaper, which is Neptavachak, one of the leading opposition newspapers, a matter of only days ago, the owners simply turned up, locked it, the journalists were locked out, the paper is finished. And apparently the rumour is that behind the owners is the government and the leading Fidesz party. And that is just the latest example. The same thing you can see happening in Romania, you can see it happening in Albania. I hope you agree with that. That there is a lot of pressure of parties, pressure of rich individuals, and this is the new element of it. But if you come onto Western Europe, very, very quickly you may think that the scenery is green grass and everything, but of course it isn't. For many years, for example, in France, it's been anybody who justifies war crimes and crimes against humanity, that is an illegal act. In Germany, for example, for obvious reasons, Holocaust denial and Nazi propaganda are banned. For example, in radio and television, you cannot play the Horst Wessel-Lied, which is the song of the Hitlerjugend. I think it's a song. You cannot publish in any newspaper the symbol of the swastika. And you may well easily say, absolutely reasonable. In Britain, it's not quite like this. There has been for very many years a committee which is called the D-Notice Committee, one of whose members comes from the Press Association as a journalist. And this committee can, if it believes national security is threatened, advise newspaper editors, radio and television editors not to touch that story. Advise. It's voluntary. Of course, they wouldn't ask any for that if there were not very good reasons, and my own feeling is that it is a reasonable system. But of course, there is theoretically the possibility it could be abused. But what's happened recently, of course, is something very additional. France, the authorities now have the power to carry out surveillance, including of mobile telephones, without any court being involved. In other words, the government has this power, and it's new. Also, to block any internet communications which could enable I'm quoting this translation, which could enable a terrorist act. Again, my own private feeling is that this is probably a very reasonable thing to do, but again, you can see there is the potential to abuse that. In Germany, the police have greater powers than they had before on anti-terrorism. In Britain, there is now a new anti-terrorism law which makes it, and I quote, a criminal offence to say or write anything that encourages terrorism. And if the purpose of anything that is spoken or written is to encourage religious hatred, that is also illegal. And one Islamic man is at the moment just beginning his 5.5 years in prison for having been found guilty under this act. Again, you may feel that these are serious attacks on the freedom of press and freedom of expression. My guess is that most people, almost all people in the 3 countries I've chosen, I haven't mentioned others, see this as a reasonable response to the world we now live in with so-called Islamic State, or do you use the word Daesh, whichever. The biggest hope, I think, that abuse of this will be avoided is that certainly in Western Europe, the number of people who are watching like hawks, eagles, whatever, that the freedom of the press and freedom of expression be protected is very, very strong. And I think that would be the great hope, that there is this potential for abuse because of the new terrorism laws.
Yes. Yes. So before opening the floor to the questions, I would like to sort of, summarize one thing, We were discussing today the life of this man, of Georgi Markov, and what we decided to do in 2010. I was appointed writer-in-residence for the BBC World Service. It was unprecedented. For the first time, they decided that some writers are working for the BBC, and I started to think sort of, interested in writers before me, working for the BBC. And I discovered that George Orwell was working there, V.S. Naipaul was working there, Georgi Markov was working there, and so on and so forth. So, all of them, they were recognized. I mean, George Orwell, everyone knows him. V.S. Naipaul got the Nobel Prize. Derek Walcott got Nobel Prize. But Georgi Markov is forgotten in a way. Though he embodies, as we today were discussing, he embodies the sort of the best of the BBC World Service in terms of the freedom of speech. He paid his life, for this freedom of speech. And we came with the idea to set up an award named after Georgi Markov for the best play, because there is a playwright competition at the BBC World Service. Every 2 years, anyone, any of you, can send your play, 45 minutes radio play, to the BBC World Service. There are 2 categories, one written in English, or written in your own language and translated into English. And there is, on the top of that, one prize for the freedom of speech. Understood widely, so named after Georgi Markov. The first winner of this competition was a young lady of your age from Mexico. She wrote about the students. You remember the students? Yes, sort of, who disappeared in Mexico. So she wrote a play about them. The second winner, whom we will be celebrating on the 26th of October, is a young man from Uganda. So as you see, the name of Georgi Markov now extends from Mexico to Uganda, and hopefully it will come back to Bulgaria one day. I hope that someone will win from Bulgaria one day the same prize. So I urge you to sort of, if you write, so please take part. If someone, that writes the plays, please pass this information on to them. Thank you. And now the floor is open for the questions.
Yeah, may I add something? AUBG would like to thank very much not only the participants tonight, but also the Sofia Platform, which is the major organizer of series of lectures, and also maybe soon a new alternative textbook about communism is going to appear. So thank you, Eva Kopraleva is here with us, Luisa Slavkova, and all the team coming, actually Sofia, that worked hard to put together those lectures. And now the floor is yours.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
My question is to Mr. Udell, and I've read Georgi Markov's works, and what I didn't find in them was what were his, did he express any desire, like how to change the situation in Bulgaria? Was he thinking about like a revolution aided by somebody or purely Bulgarian? What were his ideas of how he's like helping bring a change to Bulgaria?
A very good question, and I'm not sure I have a very good answer. I've only one answer. Before I came here, I spent a fair amount of time talking with Annabelle, his widow, and I asked her how much hope did he have of any change in Bulgaria. His reply was none. Her reply, I'm sorry. He had no hope.
Can I add this?
I'm afraid that's the only thing I can really say. The rest, if I started going on, would be invention.
Can I add, as a writer, as a writer, you never think about the sort of changing the societies or the systems or whatever. The material which you are working is the human sort of relationship, it's a human psychology, it's the human world in a way. by changing the human behavior, by changing the human being, you know. That is the way maybe writer approaches, you know. He is not a politician, he is not a sort of, you know, a sociologist or whatever to write the recipes of changing the society. It's more about the human being and his conditions rather than the sort of, you know, society. I don't think that he was thinking so much about how to change it. Maybe he might have changed, he might have thought, but my sort of gut feeling says that he was more about understanding, you know, the human being, the motivations of people, how do they work, how do they relate to each other, and so on and so forth.
The only thing I could add to this, having thought about it, is he was a passionate Bulgarian, and his love of this country was enormous, and he kept on telling me what a brilliant place it was, the villages, the people, everything, and he was so, sorry, everything of the origins of the country, that he was enormously enthusiastic about, but I don't think he had too much optimism that he would be, it could easily change.
Mm. There is a wonderful letter of Joseph Brodsky to Václav Havel. Václav Havel decided to become a writer who is changing the world, you know. Read please the letter of Joseph Brodsky to Václav Havel to understand the sort of, you know, argumentation. Yes, please.
Oh.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Sure. So I heard you mentioned a couple of writers, and I'm not really sure what their works were about. But do you think that they were mostly exiled and imprisoned because of their stories, in essence, that because they were dissident in the stories that they were publishing, or because they had like kind of power on the public and respect from the public?
Shall I? Yeah. I think quite a lot about the sort of power of writing, yes, and I came to a conclusion which I can share quite often, that any honest writing is subversive. Any honest writing is subversive. Because, you know, by honest writing you are giving the reality as it is. Whereas the authorities usually, you know, especially in those countries, in authoritarian countries, they try to hide the nature of the reality, you know, by lies, by propaganda, by anything. We are for the, you know, for the bright future. For example, the main motto of President Karimov was, Uzbekistan will have the great future. But what about the present? What about the reality, you know? That is the problem, you know, they are building sort of communist ideas. In 20 years' time we'll be living a wonderful life, you know, the paradise will be in paradise. In the meantime, they're sort of, you know, filling up their pockets, basically, you know. And the writers, the honest writers, they sort of, you know, deconstruct the reality. And every deconstruction is subversive, you know, because you are breaking it, you know. You are showing, like the kids are breaking the sort of mechanisms in order to understand them, yeah. So you are breaking this reality in order to recreate as it is, for example. So it starts to move once again, you know. Therefore, any writing is, as I'm saying, you know, shouldn't be a sort of pamphlet asking, let's go to the streets, let's sort of, you know, fight for our rights and so on and so forth. It shows the reality as it is.
So it was basically because they were missing the parts about communism, not because they were acting against it.
I think so, yeah. And they were showing what was the reality about, you know. That you can sort of, you know, invoke these sort of changes like a witch, you know, but nothing is happening. Nothing is happening.
And the other point, of course, was the power of writers. I mean, I know people, Russian friends of mine, who sometimes got a samizdat manuscript in the evening, and they had to pass it on to somebody the next morning, and they spent their whole night working through no sleep, no nothing, because the writing was so important to them. It was, you know, it was central to their life.
There is a famous saying of Евтушенко, поэт в России больше, чем поэт. a poet in Russia is bigger than a poet, you know, he becomes a prophetic figure in a way, you know, which is wrong, I think, you know, the poet should be a poet rather than a prophet. Yeah.
Were Western European people generally interested in the oppression in countries such as Bulgaria, and did they know what was going on, since you mentioned that Markov expressed his concerns of his life a number of times? Did people generally believe him?
Well, one of your, a slight problem in hearing you, but it was one part of the question about the way that people in Western Europe perceived what was happening in this world. I think for people who were interested, who wanted to know what was happening, it was possible to discover some of what was happening. But we were desperately, certainly in the 70s, I think it was changing with each decade that went on, certainly in the 70s, it was desperately difficult to discover what was happening so often. If you've got a big event such as the East German uprising in '53, the Polish Poznan riots in '56, obviously the Czech, the Hungarian events of '56, the Czech of '68, you know, that became widely known. But so, I think, of normal life, of your parents and grandparents, we were profoundly ignorant. Your Markov question was, again, can you...
Did people...
Did they believe to him?
Yeah, did they believe his concerns of his life were...
Right.
wrong?
Okay. Again, I make a distinction. I am sure that his colleagues were sensitive, in the Bulgarian section, were sensitive to his concerns. I am equally sure that people like myself, innocent Englishmen, found it very difficult in the days between the 7th and 10th or 11th of September 1978, between the attack and the death. We found it very difficult to accept that this was possible. For me, it only ended, my uncertainty only ended, as I tried to explain, when I saw these photographs of the two pellets. It was, then of course, I think everybody became extremely sensitive. And then you had this extraordinary event, which you may not know very much about, that 2 weeks after Markov's death, one young Bulgarian, Vlado Simeonov, did not appear for work. And because of the events of 2 weeks before, a secretary from the Bulgarian section was sent to the house where he lived and looked through the letterbox and saw Vlado lying at the bottom of the stairs, and he was dead. And again, the question is, you know, everybody was very sensitive at this point. Had he fallen down the stairs, which was one theory, and he did have a little heart problem. Was he pushed? Nobody knows. There has been no definitive thing. His parents from Plevneliev are convinced he was murdered. Most of the section is convinced, of his colleagues at that time were convinced he was murdered. But by that time, as I said, everybody was very, very sensitive. In particular, we were reassured because a man from the a policeman from the anti-terrorist squad came into the Bulgarian section and spent his days there. Well, I mean, obviously talking to people, interviewing them, but also protecting them. And I think we felt really that we were in a major, you know, a very great change had happened. We had to recognize that what we thought was impossible was not impossible.
May I intervene here for a while? I think your question was about whether Bulgarian public believed Markov broadcast or not.
No, actually I was referring to the foreign public, because I'm
Or the
sure
foreign public.
they didn't have that much information at the time.
I can tell you, as someone who lived under communism most of my time, the only source of real information was BBC, and then Radio Free Europe, and no one believed the propaganda, communist propaganda of our times. And actually, what we've heard in the morning was Handel music, the opening of the BBC broadcasting, and we grew up with the real belief that everything that we're fed up by the propaganda is total trash, and the only way to understand what's happening here in Bulgaria was to listen to BBC and to Radio Free Europe. This is how we live.
And it wasn't only a Bulgarian phenomenon.
Yeah, everywhere, in Russia, all around Eastern Europe.
Certainly in the Soviet Union, which I became very much concerned with, it was quite incredible that people were as badly informed. And of course, what happened for many of these years was that the Western voices, VOA, Voice of America, BBC, Deutsche Welle, Radio, etc., were being jammed. This is Rushabane. And that was a major phenomenon of our time. We tried to get the signal through, and the authorities in these countries did everything they could at enormous cost, because they were having to use huge amounts of electricity to try to jam these Western voices.
Other questions? Yes, please.
It's a well-known fact that when Georgi Markov was still living in Bulgaria, he was a close friend of the Bulgarian socialist leader Todor Zhivkov. How did that influence, well, sort of relative, yeah, but how did that influence his journalistic work later on? And was it, in your opinion, is it a coincidence that the day that he died marked the 67th birthday of Todor Zhivkov?
Yeah. I find this quite difficult to answer, because my sources on this are basically the book of his, which which is this book. From my reading of it, he had this strange day with Zhivkov when they were driven out in the car into the countryside and then spent hours walking together and talking and so on. Which was the one, perhaps the time when Zhivkov, and it wasn't really Markov, there were 2 or 3, I think, other writers at the same time. Then there were these dinners of the Writers' Association that Markov went to, and then there was the dinner in Borovets, which is when he sat next to Zhivkov, and when, according to the book, they talked, or Markov was asking Zhivkov about his favourite activity, which was hunting animals. But the other meetings that he had, as I understand it, 2 other meetings, were about the plays. And whether the word friendship, you use the word friendship, I think.
Well, the fact that they meet, I just said friends.
Yeah,
they weren't really friends.
The curious thing was that from these Radio Free Europe scripts, I did not get the impression of a devil, Zhivkov. I mean, he appeared to be, perhaps a little primitive, perhaps this, perhaps that, but Markov's picture of Zhivkov was not a totally negative one. How it affected him later, I don't know, because, you see, certainly in the BBC, he did nothing about Bulgarian internal politics. It wasn't part of his responsibility. He talked about it a lot. That's perhaps the nearest. But my memories are of what he talked about afterwards was extremely critical, as is so much of the book based on the Radio Free Europe scripts. Not of Zhivkov, but of the society.
Yeah. So if there are no other questions, just one question, last question to Peter. Yeah, because I mean many of our audiences are future maybe journalists as well. What would be your advice to them? As a journalist who worked so many years in the Western media.
Can I ask, which of you are hoping, possibly, that you could work in some sort of journalism in the future.
Yeah, many people, you see.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Can I therefore try this on you? Hamid has done a dirty trick on me because he is much more up to date. Hamid is today's journalist. I am from a very long time ago. But
you've got the perspective.
okay. Look, I've actually made for my own benefit a little list of things very, very quickly. Obviously, questions of accuracy, impartiality, objectivity, importance. The separating of fact and opinion, and making sure that you label both facts and opinions, what the sources are. Checking the sources very, very carefully. Making sure the sources are fact and not fiction, which they very easily can be. Reflecting different sides of an argument rather than simply looking at one set of facts. Giving the facts a human face. I think one of the best ways of losing readers, listeners, viewers is to be too abstract and to use too many statistics, too many dates, and so on and so forth. To write and broadcast in language that is as simple as possible. And again, what's very interesting, because Markov cut through with us so many of the, there's a word in English, circumlocution, sort of complicated ways of saying things. Just go direct. Keeping viewers, readers, listeners constantly in mind. Using market research to work out the sorts of areas of knowledge, looking at what sorts of areas of ignorance and prejudice the listeners might have. Learning from colleagues, but critically and selectively. And now I'm afraid this is propaganda. My biggest urge to you is to be what I call otherwise thinking. Russian, anarcho-wyshchi. In Bulgarian, I've asked for a bit of help. It is drugo or različno myslenie, to think differently, not to think in the conventional patterns. You may finish up doing something very conventional, but at least to think otherwise. I came to Bulgarian National Radio 20 years ago to try to help do some management training, and I said to them the crucial thing in management is to think otherwise, to think in different categories, new categories. And that was to managers, but I think it's the same argument, to try to think differently, not to accept the past as the best way of operating. And of course, to try to be highly active, proactive. I'll give you one quote. I met many years ago actually, the head of one of radio's most domestic internal radio's best known program. He said this to me: if Christ were to come back on earth, I would want an eyewitness report of Christ's return. But what I want most of all is the first interview with Christ. In other words, to think differently, to go for for the heart of a story, not to be satisfied with press cuttings, not to be satisfied with second-hand and propaganda. Forgive me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We can transfer this knowledge to history as well.